Good evening. My name is Eric Robinson. I'm rather nostalgic about being in this room. There with Bob Grohl's photograph on the wall, and not far from the Lovejoy printing press yoke, which Alfred Pitts and a family friend rediscovered on the banks of the Mississippi River back in 1908. This building that I'm in is the Hainer Public Library building, designed by Theodore Link back in 1908. It has the same vaulted ceiling that one sees at Reed Memorial Hall at Lewis and Clark and in the sanctuary of First Presbyterian Church here in Alton, both of which Theodore Link designed. And by the way, if you come here, you actually will notice it looks a little bit like Union Station, for good reason, because Union Station was also designed by Theodore Link. Just a little history here. And amazing, I was at this spot not very long ago, almost 50 years, when I was a little boy. And this was the children's division. And this was the seat that I occupied, right here. We're going to talk about people who were occupied in seats right there. Some of you may have read my article on Pin Oak Colony, the gestation. I would like to share some things with you about researching free black communities that the Pin Oak Colony research did remind me of very much. First of all, let's remember some little basic things. Pin Oak Colony was illegal when it started under Edward Coles back before statehood in Illinois. It was illegal for a white person to bring Negroes of any kind into Illinois. The Northwest Ordinance had forbade the importation of peoples of African descent in the Northwest Territories, specifically for the design of preventing slavery from being brought in. In spite of that, there were free black communities in southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and in southern Illinois. There were several existing in Illinois at the time that Edward Coles brought his inheritance of 20 some odd slaves to just outside Edwardsville. But they were all illegal, every one of them. And so when it's doing research of free black communities and on free black communities before the Civil War, one must remember that their status was governed by law, and oftentimes their presence was illegal. So that means that those of us who are researchers have to apply some rather key and interesting activities to get at the truth. First thing, very basic about it, where did they come from? The Coles slaves and most free blacks or most Negroes located in the St. Louis area came to this part of the country by way of the National Road, which began in Cumberland, Maryland, and ended up in Vandalia. You may be familiar with the Goshen Road, which connects Edwardsville to Vandalia. Well, most likely they arrived by means of that road as well. Now, if they came from Cumberland, Maryland, you might ask, what part of the South did they come from? Where were they slaves? Two places in particular stand out. One was Orange County, Virginia, a large part of northern Virginia that had a significant number of major planters. Think James Madison and James Monroe, to name two significant planters, and owned a significant number of slaves in the Orange County region. The other place where they probably came from as well was the eastern shore of Maryland. The eastern shore of Maryland, even today, is deep south by anybody's estimation. Back before the Civil War, it and Orange County Virginia had far more Negroes than they had whites. And it was a different type of slavery that existed there. It was more brutal, more violent, the type of slavery that one would see, say, in South Carolina or later in the Delta and Mississippi, in which the idea that you had to place as a slaveholder was an element of fear. There was also the idea that the owner of slaves had absolute control over all slaves in his property. That's something to remember. It's very important. Because for the slave, the owner provides a name. Perhaps not the name the person is known by, but the owner was free to give a new name. And the owner did. If a slave were purchased multiple times during the course of their life, they may have multiple names. And they may go back and forth between these names. In fact, some did, rather regularly. We do understand that having additional owners facilitated the escape of more than one slave through the Underground Railroad. One of the best case examples was John Anderson. His story was told by Harper Twelvetrees, who escaped from Fayette County, Missouri, after murdering a slaveholder, and he used, in his route from St. Louis to Canada, multiple names, all of them associated with names given to him by his owners, the one that he was born to and the ones who purchased him subsequently. He even went so far as to use the last name of his wife, Tomlin, and calling himself Jack Tomlin to facilitate his escape. That causes confusion for a researcher, because what happens for a researcher is they must be cognizant of multiple names that existed or that could be used. And if the slave happened to have been free and registered as law provided with the county government in, say, Illinois, they may have multiple names existing in the so-called Negro books. Which brings me into an interesting point. You all are familiar with passports, aren't you? Well, this passport, which has my personal information in it, including my birth date, is an official document. The Secretary of State owns this document. If the Secretary of State of the United States decides to say, John Robinson, my name, turn in your passport, I have to turn it in. That was not the type of document that free blacks had available to them. A free black had freedom papers, and the freedom papers were nothing more than a receipt. Or, to be a little bit more colorful about it, if you bear with me, you didn't know I had deep pockets, did you? I swear I did. A freedom paper was about as elaborate as this note urging me to return a phone call in New York City. Just a note. That's all. It's a receipt. As valuable as this note, and valuable enough that it can be torn up very easily and discarded as if it never existed. Try to do that with a passport, you're committing a felony. Take my word for it. Don't try that at home. But at any rate, here you are trying to do research on free blacks. You understand that free blacks in Illinois must have freedom papers registered with the county. The problem you have is, where can you find the freedom papers? They weren't official documents. The Negro books are one possibility. They were the formal register that people have tied to them, to the county government. But the register works on the idea that the people who are registering them, the county official, actually knew how to read and write. Something that even in the 20th century was an interesting requirement in Illinois politics. The Negro papers, and Negro books rather, moreover, were personal property of the person who was in office. They could destroy them if they wished. They could use them as kindling if they wished. Hopefully they would pass it on. There was nothing guaranteeing that. So what that means for the 21st century researcher is that even if they have a name, even if they know a person was associated with a particular area in Illinois and could have been registered in the Negro books, there's a prospect that Negro books would be incomplete or unavailable or lacking information. So, that's the problem you have as a researcher of free black communities. When we come back, we're going to talk about how a researcher might address these problems. So, you know the problem. How can we find people we know are there, but we can't prove are there? Well, there's ways around it, fortunately. First of all, in the case of Pin Oak Colony, there were churches, 2 of them. One an African Methodist Episcopal church, another a Baptist church. The Baptist church is actually very significant. It was part of the Wood River Baptist District, the Association of Free Blacks, Black Baptists, that was organized largely by John Mason Peck in Illinois, that served a variety of individuals and a variety of congregations. By the way, there's some debate as far as where the first church among Black Baptists was established. Alton and Jacksonville have been debating that for some time, whether John Livingston started the church, the African Baptist Church in Jacksonville, before he started Union Baptist Church in Alton in spring of 1837. So we don't want to go there. But let's talk about churches in the Wood River Baptist District. They had membership rolls. Now remember, the membership rolls in the Baptist faith tell when one had begun to attend service as a member of the church. And generally speaking, when you talk about that, the age of one's baptism, when there's baptismal records, is very much particular to the Baptists. Baptists do not believe in infant baptisms. They believe only adults can be baptized. And the definition for many Baptists of adults, at least before the Civil War, was 13. When a person reached 13, they were free to be baptized into the church, a sign that they accepted Jesus Christ as a personal Savior. That's very much different than when one is looking, say, at baptismal records in the Catholic Church. Oftentimes, baptismal records for the Catholic Church record baptisms within a few days of birth. So it's very easy to estimate when Ludwig van Beethoven was born if we have a baptismal record of him being baptized in the church in Bonn on December 17th, 1770. It's a little more complicated when you're talking about somebody who is from an environment that they are 13 years of age at baptism. But at any rate, the Wood River Baptist District kept baptismal records for its members. That's one thing that one can use. And if one has some particulars about the name, if one has an idea about what the family name became in adulthood, then looking at the baptismal records in the Wood River Baptist District would be an easy way of ascertaining whether a person lived in an area and what were the people around them and their families. Because oftentimes baptismal records of the Wood River Baptist District included places where a person had lived. The AME Church also kept records. They were similar to sacramental records in the Catholic Church. There were membership rolls. And on these membership rolls, which were listings of people based on class, Methodists used the class method of organizing congregations, they would have listed not only the head of the household, but the members of the household. So you may have, if you have a name, any name, say Missouri Samuels, actually did live in Wood River Township. Not Wood River Township, Pin Oak Township. Missouri Samuel's name, you could actually go to the AME Church's records and list of the classes to identify her parents' name, Carrie and Albert Samuels. That's a little bit more of a guarantee than looking at simply for the Negro books. The other thing you can use as well, if you have them available, and sometimes they are available, are family Bibles. Not all families allow strangers to look at their Bibles. You have to be very careful in talking to them. But there's a second way of doing that. If you have a date of death, look for the obituaries. The obituaries will actually list members of the family. You can go backwards to find other members of the family by looking for their obituaries. The obituaries typically have dates and places of birth as well. They have the names of the family members who are associated with the person, one's parents, one's siblings. And that at least indicates for us what the family understood as being the case. And the family would actually be considered a verifiable piece of information. By the way, this is an old technique. You, of course, know that not everybody was given a birth certificate. Sometimes you had to go on other information. When the Social Security Act required that everybody states the date of birth, the Social Security Administration back in the 1930s to 1950s did accept biblical records and sacramental records as information in lieu of a birth certificate that may or may not have been produced. But there's another complication. It goes back to names. You know, ladies and gentlemen, a person who's a free black might have one name that everybody knew him by and a familiar name that members of the family knew them by. That's another complication. Sometimes you can tell by people referring to somebody, some odd person, by that odd name. The famous Uncle Bobby, for example, was active in Pin Oak Township as a Baptist preacher. You do a little research, you might find Uncle Bobby was what everybody called him. Another name that you might think about as well. Are you familiar that the name Harriet Tubman was not the name that her parents had given her? Her parents didn't give her the name Harriet. They called her Alma Rita. And apparently, for her entire life, she asked her friends to call her Alma Rita. But to the public, she was known as Harriet Tubman. Another interesting complication. Well, that gets to be an interesting thing when you talk about researching free black communities. It's not as much genealogy, it's more uncovering a mystery. And you need clues for mysteries. Clues here, clues there, that facilitate uncovering the facts. Some clues you actually hear are rather interesting and rather telling. Other clues you hear might open up an entirely different world. They may tell you more about the people who lived there, rather than just the names of the people who lived in those areas. Let's talk a little bit about some of the clues that might talk about the people's lives. To say, for example, that Pin Oak Colony was a free black community that existed before the start of the Civil War and ended, about the time of World War I, it's not telling us everything that we need to know about that community. It doesn't tell us everything. Who were the people there? What did they do? How did they live? There might be some other ways that we can flesh that out as historians. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Let's talk about what the clues happen to tell us about free black communities such as Pin Oak Colony. What did they do? How did they do that? Where did they live? Where they lived is very simple. They lived on the Marine Road. But if you go to Marine Township, down the Marine Road into Pin Oak Colony, into Pin Oak Township rather, you take a nice look around at the territory. You see agriculture. You see waterways. Look at things with the eyes of somebody that's a new resident, not with the eyes of somebody that moved in there from, say, West County. Take a nice, good look at the soil. Rich soil, like Pin Oak Colony soil, grew a lot of corn. So you can assume that one of the things the population did was entirely agricultural. There are the things that you can actually glean as far as the clues are concerned. Smelters in the St. Louis area were often immigrant populations. Think of the smelting plant in Elorton, the American Aluminum Company smelter. They were mostly people from the Delta. Or you can say the same thing about the smelter that was located in Alton, American Smelting Company. They were people from the Delta, from down in Mississippi and Arkansas, came here looking for work, and they found it an easy job. Well, those smelters were also immigrants from elsewhere. But they were not that far away. They were not from the Delta. They were just down the road, Pin Oak Colony. The farmers who were there also were involved in raising crops for food and for work. The rich soil that's present in Pin Oak Colony provided a significant amount of work. We know from William Tandy, one of the last residents of Pin Oak Colony, who was able to speak about growing up in that area back about 100 years ago, described having a lot of blacksmiths along the main drag. He was one of the blacksmiths on Main Street. Elbert Samuels was another. Elbert Samuels was an ancestor of mine. And they worked with a variety of people who came in as farmers. And they were involved in the creation of the nice ironwork that was used for horses and used for teamsters. These facts demonstrate that the populations that were located in Pin Oak Colony may have had an integral activity in the other economic part of Edwardsville. There are other ways that we can also define them. For example, there are nice old cabinets that one finds in some of these homes in Edwardsville, handed down family to family to family, with those square nails, blacksmith's nails. We know that blacksmiths made nails, especially blacksmiths who were former slaves. Most likely, the blacksmiths who worked in Edwardsville, who were from Pin Oak Colony, made those nails as well. But the thing that I think we should be aware of are the lives that these people led outside of the economic life of Edwardsville. You can't overstate the importance of the Lincoln School community. Lincoln School is still a standing building. It's on the far edge of town. That was the Negro school in Edwardsville. Not, by the way, controlled by the Edwardsville School District. Lincoln School, as Mrs. H. told us many years ago, was actually organized and maintained by the Madison County Superintendent of Schools. But if you start with Pin Oak Colony to the north and Lincoln School to the south, and you figure that not far from Pin Oak Colony in the north was Aldrich Street, where Wesley Chapel AME Church was organized, and along Schwartz Street there were people who attended Mount Joy Baptist Church when it moved into Edwardsville on Olive Street. And you kind of got an idea the routes these people traveled during the course of a week. Children, and usually they were no older than 14, rode the carts and walked over to Lincoln School the same way their parents went over to the smelter. Maybe they made a U-turn and went back to the smelter and dropped off the fathers and the men to work there. They went back and got the kids. Then you have, incidentally, the blacksmith shop, where people would do work as well. And then the churches nearby. Yeah. It's a pretty interesting story if one stops to think about it. You actually have lived lives in Pin Oak Colony that actually expands the story that we have of just being a free black community of about 400 in 1850. A little bit more flesh to the bones. That makes it a rather interesting story. Interesting story that tells us a bit about ourselves. And by the way, among all that, the Madison County Courthouse, where you have to register your freedom papers. You know, remember those? And the people along the way that you'd see. So you have a community that was actually a little bit more active in the general society than just saying a free black community that is situated outside of Edwardsville. A research community like Pin Oak Colony can be fleshed out by adding these details. And you can also add, eventually, the various names. The names of the family members who were involved in Pin Oak Colony, where they lived, how they existed, how did they marry, how did they intermarry, what were these relationships among the various people who married each other. Things that, looking for more than just community that was there based on some names, this name, that name, can actually flesh out for us. Pin Oak Colony, a research community. Little detail here and there that makes it a little bit more vibrant for those of us who are historians.